You want another trouble with you? You think it makes you a big man if you give the answers. But at the right time, I'll catch up with you. Be thinking about that. Now go on, beat it. Don't push your luck.
Wait a minute, you. You take them heaters away from you and you're nothing. You know that?
You talk yourself in the river.
You take the good goods away and the kickbacks and a shakedown cabbage and a pistol arrows and you're nothing. Your guts is all in your wallet and your trigger finger. You know that?
You ratted on us, Terry.
From where you stand, maybe, but I'm standing over here now. I was ratting on myself all them years. I didn't even know it.
Come on.
You give it to Joey, you give it to Dugan, you give it to Charlie, who was one of your own. You think you're God Almighty, but you know what you are?
Come on.
You're a cheap, lousy, dirty, stinking mug. And I'm glad what I've done to you. You hear that? I'm glad what I've done. And I'm gonna keep on doing it till I get... Come on! Come on!
This is one of those movies where I think it's very well known, accepted for being very strong, and I think anybody who watches it appreciates that, but it's also burdened by a lot of political associations, be they real or imaginary, which sort of leaves not just this film, but Elia Kazan's whole career in a sort of netherworld.
Right. And I also think this film is more known by things referencing it.
Sure, exactly. And then it's the film in which sort of we first... It's not the exact first, but it's probably one of the best early examples of the embodiment of Marlon Brando-isms.
Yeah.
You know,
but I mean, like, you think about the I Could Have Been a Contender speech, which people know from Rocky.
Yeah.
Right? Which is a direct reference to On the Waterfront. I mean...
Yeah, pretty much Rocky is in the same situation as Terry Malloy.
Right, except he manifests it through fighting as opposed to Terry Malloy, who manifests it through getting his ass kicked and starting a union.
Well, no, Terry Malloy manifests it by taking a dive willingly for the short money, probably out of fear, probably out of wanting to support his brother.
Right. Whereas it's a different deal with... But, you know, and there are other things about this movie. Brando is by far the best actor in it.
No, I would actually, I'm going to pause and say no on that one. I would say there are 5 extraordinarily strong performances, of which actually I think Lee J. Cobb rivals Brando. So like part of...
Oh yeah, no, I'll take that back. Johnny Friendly's a really good performance.
So like what's the funny thing about this movie, when you sort of situate it, it's sort of like America's attempt at neo-realism, and that if you compare it to a lot of the other films of the earlier and even through the 50s, you don't really see a lot of location shooting, and this is nearly all location shooting, if not all location shooting. But what's weird about it, just by virtue of the way American films compose music, for example, or particularly in Marlon Brando's performance, it's sort of like I wouldn't say Marlon Brando's over the top, because he does do his naturalist style acting, but he's in a role which is very dramatically composed, whereas Lee J. Cobb is in a role which he can't help but be just very realistically coarse. So I think in a way Lee J. Cobb very much rivals Brando in this movie. And Lee J. Cobb, and in a way Lee J. Cobb does something very similar in a movie that comes out a few years later, the 12 Angry Men, in which it's even more extreme, where you have like Henry Fonda basically playing a Christ-like figure. Again, Terry Malloy sort of is too, but it's more extreme, more artificial. He's not really like a real person. Juror number 6 is not a real person.
No,
but Lee J. Cobb is just unbearably real.
All those jurors are archetypes. We can also talk about like why you think Criterion finally put it back out, because I'm assuming this was almost gone in a lot of ways before Criterion re-released it.
So, it's a weird situation this movie, because Columbia, it's a prestige movie from Columbia. It won Best Picture, actor and supporting actress and supporting actor. It was released on DVD a while ago, but you're right. In a way, it's one of those well-known forgotten movies, if we can use that kind of oxymoron kind of thing. And it's not like well-known. It's like, oh, we know that it was a great movie that's lost to time. It's like, no, we know it's a great movie. We have it readily available to hand, and yet we don't talk about it.
Right. I mean, we could talk, I'm looking at the release dates for it stuff, and at both times it was released early on. Well, 2001 is not early on in the DVD cycle, but the first home video release of it was both VHS and Beta in 1984, and it seems like it was just so early and such an old movie, and in the 80s.
Goodfellas kind of has that thing too. Like, Goodfellas is like one of the earliest DVD releases. It's one of the earliest Blu-ray releases, and as a result, it comes across as like it's a shitty copy. But it's not really because it's shitty. It's because it's like it was so we wanted to get it out fast type thing.
Well, yeah, because everybody's gonna want on Goodfellas.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I'd say like my introductory remarks to On the Waterfront, even though we've already talked about it a little bit, is really. But what's interesting, even more so than the politics about it to me, is like how it has to sort of negotiate between what I sort of referenced a little earlier, which was, on the one hand, it's trying to be very, very realistic in its depiction and its performances, what have you, and yet at the same time, it has to also navigate the fact that it is artificial and it's has very artificial moments in it, not just in terms of scenes, the way they're constructed, but also the music very obviously is arguably over the top, and I think a lot of people who even like the movie will admit, yeah, it's over the top, but you just live with it. So that's to me is like an interesting just sort of aesthetic position that this movie has to navigate through. And then obviously, yes, all of the peripheral sort of political and social elements tied to the movie also, you just can't escape it. And I think it's also why we're sort of hinting around like why people aren't talking about the movie, even though they know it and they somewhat talk about the movie.
Well, and there's other reasons I think it would make it harder for a modern audience to watch, because it's kind of in that transition period in acting. So you have Cobb and Brando, who are doing very theatrical, but in a more naturalistic filmic sense, acting. Mm-hmm. And you have a lot of the other classic actors around them who have been acting, in talkies since maybe the 40s, but you can tell they were trained in stage acting. Mm-hmm. And so, like, their movements and stuff and their mannerisms are comically exaggerated, but not like Cobb's is, which Cobb's feels like a person.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about movies from the early 50s, I think that's actually part of the reason why people don't approach them, is because people don't really know how to watch them.
Yeah, and I think that's also true of even earlier movies like the 40s and the 30s, probably more so, because like you said, it's like it may even be given the nature of how sound was recorded up until maybe even the 50s, where you had to sort of like, they didn't really have ADR recording, so rather than sound like this is insider baseball, ADR is additional dialogue recording. You basically go into sound booth and re-record lines to make you sound a little bit clearer. And basically, in those old days, the audio recording wasn't really up to snuff, and so they had to really clearly enunciate themselves, and it is a little bit borrowed from a theater of the time. So what you get from performances is it's artificial, but then again, almost every performance is, but it doesn't really give the illusion of being like overheard. And Marlon Brando very famously, and Lee J. Cobb as well, and basically starting in the 50s, film is introducing something that's gives the impression of a naturalism. So yeah, you're right. There, people will respond to Brando. They'll probably respond to Lee J. Cobb, but Carl Malden may seem a little odd, or the background characters may seem a little odd. Yeah. You're totally right. But it's like one of those things where if you watch a lot of movies, you sort of get used to it and you just understand how to read it.
It's part of filmic literacy. I mean, we expect this from literature, but film has not been around long enough that you really teach people like, this is what good acting was in the 30s because this is what the technological limitations were. And also, this is what people were used to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, when you add all that together, you do get somewhat of a hard sell. I mean, even Citizen Kane sometimes is actually a hard sell, you know?
Yeah.
And that's Orson Welles, who's also one of the first, you know, truly filmic actors in a way. Mm-hmm. And you know, everybody knows they're supposed to love that movie, but you have to really try to get into it, I think, if you're not trained in those old movies. But you're right, there's a lot more going on that kind of keeps this.
Right, yeah, exactly. And that's why I sort of really emphasize is like this is America's response or attempt to do neo-realism. In the post-war Italian period, you have bicycle thieves, you have Rossellini's Rome pictures, any number of things. What are they known for? It's like first we won't use real actors, we'll use actual people. Well, Hollywood isn't going to do that. It can do, you know, Hollywood may pull in like New York actors or a new acting style to give an impression of that, but it's not going to do that. Location shooting, yeah, Hollywood's going to try and do that. And this is where it's sort of, I wouldn't say this is perfectly where it starts, but I'd say this is one of the earliest examples of that. So they're actually filming in, I think, Hoboken, New Jersey, even though it takes place in New York. The reason they didn't film in New York because the unions literally said, if you try to film here, we're going to kill you. I mean, no joke. That's what Bud Schulberg, the screenwriter, basically says. He told that to Spike Lee. So, but that may be a tangent, but the point is, like, yeah, we're sort of going there, and I think anybody also starting to pay attention of films throughout the 50s and the 60s, you know, you do see this tension in Hollywood that they're trying to negotiate doing something different with the screen, somewhat arguably more realistic, or at least more. Give the impression of grandness as a means of competing with television. Because the old artificiality of film can easily be encapsulated in television, and not only that, you don't even have to leave your house. So, you know, this may be an early first attempt to say, like, hey, let's try and do something a little bit unique, or something that film can do that television, at least at that point, really didn't have the chops for, or wasn't doing. Add all these things together, we're in a blender, you know, you get the making of, or at least the behind the scenes, technically, of On the Waterfront.
Right, and I mean, it's also a very interesting screenplay. I mean, for one, it was originally written by Arthur Miller, but Miller broke with Kazan over the House Un-American Activities Committee stuff, and we'll get to that later. And so Bud Schulberg had to come in and do all the rewrites on the script, and also, I think, write large parts of it, but it had already been laid out by Miller, and it was already based on... was it a nonfiction book or a nonfiction series of articles by Malcolm Johnson?
That sounds right. I know it was pretty much, whether or not it was based on an actual book or not, was based on the events and the sort of news following, for lack of a better term, of what was going on in the Longshoremen docks. And what was happening in the unions. I mean, you think, I know Hoffa is like a little bit later, but I mean, this is Hoffa's world we're essentially dealing with. He's a Teamster, which is truck driving, but that kind of, what we think about what the unions were like around this time, you know, that's basically what we're dealing with here. You know, if you think of Hoffa, but on the shore, that you get a sense of what's going on there and what people were trying to capture or deal with.
I mean, a lot of it's, I mean, that history is interesting. You look at the 1930s and the 1940s. I think this is right before the AFL-CIO joined together and they kick out the communists. But a lot of what else goes on, you know, the Wobblies and the you know, more inland Midwestern industrial unions tried to spread east and south, and they get crushed in the 1920s and 30s. And so a lot of the older unions in New York justify what they're doing by teaming up with the mob on that. So, you know, this anti-union violence in the decade earlier gets used as sort of a cover, you know, an internal self-justification for working with the mob.
It's funny. I just looked up the AFL and CIO merge in '55, which is a year after this film. So it's basically like hot right at the moment. And yeah, I mean, and it's funny that this notion of like, why are we teaming up with the mob and everything? It's like, well, one of the best things about the film is you get a sense of how justification manifests itself, and you get it throughout the film. But Lee J. Cobb, sort of talks about when you're growing up, however many people in his household on a watchmaker's pension, you have to fight just to get the ability to feed yourself.
Hey! Oh. What gives with our boy tonight, Charlie? He ain't himself.
It's just the Joey Doyle thing and how he exaggerates the things. Just too much Marcus of Queensberry. It softens him up.
Listen, kid, I'm a soft touch, too. Ask any rummy on the dock if I ain't good for a fin any time they put the arm on me. But my old lady raised us 10 kids on a stinking watchman's pension. When I was 16, I had to beg for work in the hole. I didn't work my way up out of that for nothing.
Look, I know that, Johnny. I know it.
Taking over this local took a little doing. There's some pretty rough fellas in the way. They give me this to remember them by.
He had to keep his hand over his throat to stay alive, and he still went after them. I know what.
I know what's eating you. Well, I got 2,000 dues-paying members in this local. That's 72,000 a year legitimate. And when each one of them puts in a couple of bucks a day just to make sure the work's steady, well, figure it out. Not just for openers. We got the fattest piers and the fattest harbor in the world. Everything moves in and out, we take our cut.
Why shouldn't we? If we can get it, we're entitled to it.
You don't suppose I can afford to be boxed out of a deal like this, do you? A deal I sweated and bled for, and I got one lousy little cheese eater, that Doyle bum who thinks he can go squealing to the crime commission, do you? Well, do you?
I mean, if you think about, the timeline of these characters, these people, at least the older guys, the leadership, are growing up in the 30s. So they're coming up in a rough time, just barely be able to survive. And so they say to themselves, well, look, we have these fat harbors, World War II has finished itself. The United States is prosperous economically. Why don't we get our fair cut? And, we're the mechanism to assure that happens. And, people pay a little extra to make sure that everything's working fine. That all makes sense to them. And you can rationalize anything, and you can take it to the next step. It's like, hey, if some guy tries to break this mechanism, which helps everybody out, he's threatening his own people. Why shouldn't he be pushed around? Why shouldn't he be beat on? Why shouldn't he take a fall off the roof? This whole movie, in a way, is an exercise in exploring all the various justifications and rationalizations we give each other to do what we do.
It's interesting, given I think this movie's often misread as the mob being a stand-in for communists, which I don't think it is. But I have read readings of that, readings of this movie where they accuse Kazan of basically using the mob as a stand-in for communist influence. Which is weird because that's really based more on his biography and the context at the time. I mean, there were communists, and there were even Stalinist communists in the labor unions with ties to the Comintern, at least until the immediate aftermath of World War II. But that looks very different than this.
The way I look at it is that I think the film can be generalized in a way. So I think the film really is concerned about this idea of like communal authority and communal power. And this idea that we're out for you. That power that really operates in the sense that look, we're looking out for you. We're doing okay for you. Aren't I like your local, basically like your local chieftain, this, that, and the other, and why would you rat out on one of your brothers and everything? And so that, to me, is really an exercise in the mechanisms which allow that to happen, which I think in a lot of ways can be applied to sort of how any sort of authority would operate that way. And I think in many instances, party discipline functions very similarly. I agree, you don't need to read it into the film, and because you'll get everything that the film wants if you don't read into it that way. But there's something that Kazan wrote, I think when he was actually talking about why he it was his statement to the House Un-American Activities Committee, and one of the things he was talking about was party discipline here, which I think sort of helps maybe get to where I'm going at. So I'm going to read just a quick paragraph from that. What I learned was that the minimum that anyone must learn who puts his head into the noose of party discipline. The communists automatically violated the daily practices of democracy to which I was accustomed. They attempted to control thought and to suppress personal opinion. They tried to dictate personal conduct. They habitually distorted and degraded and violated the truth. All this was crudely opposite to their claims of democracy and the scientific approach. To be a member of the Communist Party is to have a taste of this police state. It is a diluted taste, but it is bitter and unforgettable. It is diluted because you can walk out. So to me, I mean, that, you remove the specifics of the communist reference. That to me is a general statement of any sort of organized principle. Right. And so that's why I think, the film lends itself to to that parable reading, that you can you can read in, the justification of Kazan's talking to the House Un-American Activities Committee. But it's, as I said before, I mean, it's generic enough to really not have to. And the funny thing is, I think Scorsese, who's a big fan of the film, actually thinks that the portions of the film which come closest to, the quote-unquote justification for talking to the House Un-American Activities Committee, or that reading of the film in that way, to him always felt the weakest. So he didn't go too much into it in the interview I saw, but you do get the sense that if it is there, it's not really the heaviest mechanism in the film, or the mechanism that's doing the most work. I think actually what Scorsese responds to more than anything else is, again, this attempt to do sort of like a neo-realist picture. This attempt to depict the rough conditions of what people have to go through. And I think he probably thinks that came across as unrealistic, right? So if you go up to, Friendly and say, I'm glad of what I've done, you really don't walk away, right?
Right.
He doesn't have optimism. And you can see that in Scorsese's pictures that sort of operate in tangential spaces to On the Waterfront.
Well, it's interesting because this movie is both cynical and hopeful in a very smart way. Like, the ending is a rally point ending. Mm-hmm. But it's not a rally point ending where there's no cost, where the good guys just win. I mean, they do win, but they do it at the cost of, Terry Malloy has been beaten nearly to death. He is barely alive when he gets up and walks into that factory. I mean, into those docks.
I mean, and also, let's, in the earlier context of the movie, he's lost his brother. His girlfriend lost her brother. They lost a friend of theirs. Even the priest, Carl Malden's character, who's sort of helping facilitate people along the path to sort of speaking truth to the Union, even he's not safe from anything. And you get a sense that people, or the Union members, are willing to sort of, at the end, have some sort of resistance to Johnny Friendly, but you really don't get a sense that, their victory is secured.
No, and you get a sense that, that maybe Johnny Friendly is lost now, but he's still got the mob, and they'll have to maintain... he has the mob until the investigation's done, and you don't know how that's going to go.
Mm-hmm. You get I got the sense that you can feel comfortable that Johnny Friendly isn't going to be around too long to run this union, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't going to be another Johnny Friendly.
Right, but it is interesting. I mean, you think about what a movie like this, if it was made now, what it would say about unions. It would basically imply that unionism, itself would probably corrupt. If you look at, just the way movies go now, I think there's a lot of that left, right, and center. But this is not an anti-union movie in the we have a problem with people organizing as labor. In fact, their whole problem is that the union is corrupt and is not doing what unions are supposed to do. And the Friendly doesn't even acknowledge that he's being so, his patronage scheme is like getting so extreme that he's keeping like half the dock workers from making a living.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I think maybe since we talked about what would a contemporary response to something like this be, I think that the obvious example to use is in the second season of The Wire. We actually do what stevedores, or basically the same thing as longshoremen's.
He thinks we'd leave him there on the dock in a box, dying there in the dark because why, detective? What reason would we have to want girls to die like that? Why would any of us leave him in there if we knew anything about it? I got a wife and 3 sisters, and they got daughters. And I got too much respect for women not to be pissed off at what's in your heads right now.
But of all the cans on the terminal, that's the one you lose in the stacks.
We didn't know shit, goddammit! You want us to dance with a grand jury, we will. What do you say, Johnny? What do you say to any question?
I take the 5th commandment.
And if they offer you immunity to testify against your union brothers?
I don't remember.
Don't remember what?
Nothing.
What you're forgetting, detective, is that every IBS local on the East Coast has had its ass in front of a federal grand jury 2 or 3 times already. You want to throw your summonses? Throw them. You want to subpoena our records? Shit, you don't even need a subpoena no more. Our books have been open to the Justice Department for 8 years. We're here through Bobby Kennedy, Tricky Dick Nixon, Ronnie the Union Buster Reagan, and half a dozen other sons of bitches. We'll be here through your weak bullshit, no problem.
Yeah, it's a similar situation where they're not really obviously they're not critiquing unionism per se, because the creative team behind The Wire is firmly pro-union, but they do sort of understand that the unions are willing to negotiate and work with the mob in large part because of the position they're in as a result of what happened basically in John Friendly's time, as a result of the corruption that was already there, Ronald Reagan's union busting activities and any number of union busting activities famously started by Bobby Kennedy. The unions were extraordinarily humbled and very weak, and to the point where you don't even have to get a subpoena to access their financials anymore. It was just public record as a result of this corruption. So they're humbled in a way that in order to even get work for everybody. I mean, it's not even like in Johnny Friendly where he's just doling out jobs he wants to dole out to the people he wants. It's like they don't even have the jobs to dole out to everybody now. So in a desperate attempt to get extra things for people, they are willing to,
right. And particularly in these, because the longshoremen aren't an industrial union, they're a tradesman union. That's sort of important to realize because industrial unions collective bargain more. In a sense that you're a long-term employee of the company, but the dock workers aren't they're a long-term employee of the dock. Maybe, I mean, it's like being a member of the writers union. You're contract workers. You're contract workers, and that structure is very different. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because it explains why they would why they would team up with the mob in another way too, because. And that's actually similar with the Teamsters because you don't have a corporate structure to hang yourself onto. And you don't have really a whole lot of enforcement mechanism other than your own violence and your willingness to intimidate scabs because you can't really have a closed shop unless you own the harbor. All this stuff plays into this. I mean, it's very interesting to talk about. Now, too, because I think now we're in a time where yes, people see labor unions as kind of corrupt, but they don't see them as corrupt by the mob. They see them as basically a corrupt, appendage of usually the Democratic Party.
Right. It's not so now. It's funny. It's like in this film, you're right. The corruption seems to come sort of from outside. I mean, yes, it's of the union, but it's the mob influence on the union. You're right. Now it seems like unions are corrupt. Period. Right. It's just of their nature.
I mean, and I'm from an area of the country where unions pretty much don't exist. But, they kind of do. But the only unions I really knew about, the public sector unions were illegal in Georgia. And so when I studied a lot of union history, And I remember watching this movie and Mate One, which is another really good movie about this sort of thing, although from a completely different standpoint.
And a much earlier era, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the 1910s. But these movies seem really removed from us now because unless you're in New York or California, and even if you are, the likelihood you're a member of a union is like, what? 1 in 6 at best? And that's only if you work in one of these trades, like one of these contract worker trades, or if you work at, a northern auto plant or something, which good luck on that. Or if you are a teacher in like 40 of the 50 states. Or, there's just not it's not just that unionism might seem corrupt. It's like people just don't have any idea really what they're still doing.
We're not a unionized country, in part because we're not really a super industrial country anymore. Right. I mean, we're just more white collar now.
And trade unions make sense for blue collar contract work, and they still do. And also, it's hard to tell what those unions are going to do. I mean, like a lot of the electricians unions, interestingly enough, endorse Romney, I believe. So their politics are not as set as they would have seen in the 40s and 50s. But, we're also talking about New York. I mean, mob and machine politics is part of New York culture going back, I don't know, since there was New York and it wasn't New Amsterdam.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about all of this stuff, can easily be tied to, Tammany Hall, and that's, the Civil War period and earlier. I mean, you're right. It's just integrated into the city, but it's also integrated to a lot of big cities. I mean, like Chicago is just as extreme.
Maybe more extreme.
Maybe more so. Boston, I would say. Baltimore, if Baltimore's sort of lumbering by with everything.
Yeah, but Baltimore is sort of the line for that. Have you noticed? It's like, I mean, we're off into culture, but the larger culture in that movie. We'll come back to the movie in a second. But it is interesting that this movie makes a lot of sense in New York. Maybe now, if it was like 20 years later, you could see it set in California. But you can't see it set in the ports of Charleston ever. I mean, it's neo-realist because the topic kind of means it has to be. It can't be one of those generic every American films because large swaths of the U.S., even though they had longshoremen, were completely alien to this.
Right, it's extraordinarily specific to a time and place. And like you said, in a way, maybe... I don't even think that's really the reason why it's sort of out of public consciousness in a way. Maybe it is, but the film is unlike other Hollywood films, which are attempts to be quote unquote timeless. This dates itself very obviously, very directly.
Although in a way, I'll defend the movie that dates itself very obviously is very directly against a lot of the quote-unquote timeless movies that don't think they're dating themselves.
Yeah, they're just not aware of how they're dating themselves.
Right. You can think of a bunch of movies from the 80s that would have thought, oh, this speaks to everybody forever. And
everything by John Hughes, for example, I would argue.
Right, exactly. Like that's supposed to be every white suburban kid, right? That's so specific to like 1982 to 1987. I mean,
mm-hmm. I mean, it's sort of familiar to me because it's like suburban Chicago, like in better to do neighborhoods. Like, yeah, I know that, but yeah, they act like it's universal. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, or Back to the Future.
It's true.
To mention a sort of lowbrow but good example that like, oh, that's universal. Oh my God, that movie. So.
Well, I mean, like your time traveler machine is a DeLorean. I mean, that dates you automatically,
right? But like, even when it like makes fun of how 80s it is and tries to see past itself, it imagines the future all wrong.
Oh yeah, it's like the joke is like we're only 2 years away from it, yeah, or 1 year away from it now, I think.
Yeah, we're supposed to already have hoverboards.
Yeah, but going back to the movie
on the waterfront.
Yeah, like one of the things I wanted to get into is sort of like we didn't really talk about it, though I think it's central, is this Terry Malloy's arc, to use a cliche term, right? So, we're dealing with a guy who, and we don't know it until later, is sort of already broken by this union in a way. So we already get a sense that, he was a boxer, probably not too long ago, doing very well. The union decided to, in his words, get a piece of him, namely like, oh, we'll support you as long as, do what we want. And he's forced to take a dive and basically ruin his chances of becoming a champion, like the quote-unquote contender. In other words, a chance to be recognized, to have done something to get public attention, or to have at least achieved something which he would have felt was done on his own.
Think about getting some ambition.
Well, I always figured I'd live a little bit longer without it.
Maybe. There's a boss loader slot that's open on the new pier we're opening up. You see, now it pays 6 cents on every 100 pounds that goes in and every 100 pounds that goes out, and you don't have to lift a finger. That's $200, $300, $400 a week. $400 a week just for the openers.
I get all that dough for not doing nothing.
You don't do anything, and you don't say anything. You understand?
There's more to this than I thought, Charlie. I'm telling you, there's a lot more.
You don't mean that you're thinking of testifying against some people that we might know?
I don't know, Charlie. I mean, I'm telling you, I don't know, Charlie. That's what I want to talk to you about.
Well, listen, Terry, you know how much those piers are worth that we control through the local? I know that. All right, you think that Johnny's going to jeopardize the whole setup for one rubber-lipped ex-tanker who's walking on his heels? What the?
Better.
That's not the point.
I could have been a lot better,
The
Charlie.
point is we don't have much time.
I'm telling you, I haven't made up my mind
Well,
yet.
make up your mind before we get to 437 River Street.
Before we get to where, Charlie? Before we get to
Listen
where?
to me, Terry. Take the job. Just take it. No questions. Take it. Terry, take this job, please.
Charlie.
Please take it.
Charlie. Oh, Charlie. Wow.
Look, kid. How much you weigh, Slip? When you weighed 168 pounds, you were beautiful. You could have been another Billy Kahn. That skunk we got you for the manager, he brought you along too fast.
It wasn't him, Charlie. It was you. You remember that night in the garden? You came down my dressing room and said, "Kid, this ain't your night. We're going for the price on Wilson." You remember that? This ain't your night. My night. I could have taken Wilson apart. So what happens? He gets the title shot outdoors in a ballpark, and what do I get? A one-way ticket to Palookaville. You was my brother, Charlie. You should have looked out for me a little bit. You should have taken care of me just a little bit so I wouldn't have to take them dives for the short-end money.
Well, I had some bets down for you. You saw some money.
You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody. Instead of a bum, which is what I am. Let's face it. It was you, Charlie.
So in that context, he now is basically just a cog in the union machine. It starts off with him playing a role in getting some guy who's going to testify against the unions in a position where they can kill him. And he's negotiating throughout the film with this sense of guilt, which he does and does not acknowledge, depending on what point of the film you're in. And to me, that's like a very old style story, but it really works well, I think, in this neo-realist setting. In part because Brando is acting in a way that is fairly naturalistic, and that story can easily have been extreme or over the top. I think there are some moments like this where, just given the nature of the way the storytelling is told, Brando is a little bit more theatrical than what we would typically associate with Brando, but I still think it holds up, and I wanted to get a sense of how you were thinking about that.
I think it holds up too. It's weird because it does feel like we would look at this and go, oh, Brando and Cobb are acting circles around everybody, including Eva Marie Saint, who won a Best Supporting Actress role for this movie. It is, I think the moments where it's a little bit heavy is like his big speech at the end, which is a great scene, but it's not. It is obviously dramatic.
I think that's the scene in particular I referenced earlier where Scorsese says, "I don't buy it." I think that and I think that scene is the scene people are thinking about when they say, "Oh, it's Kazan speaking for his justification for testifying to HUAC." But I don't. Again, like to your point, I don't necessarily say that. Oh yeah, that's exactly what the film is supposed to represent. To me, what's really over the top is the symbolism of the pigeons and the hawk.
Oh yeah, I was like, that's heavy-handed writing. I don't know if that's Schulberg or Miller, but it's like, damn.
Miller would do that, though. I feel like Miller has a tendency to go there. I mean, obviously, The Crucible is itself an exercise in heavy-handedness.
Oh yeah, and kind of in retrospect, wrong-headed heavy-handedness. But not to justify McCarthyism, because I don't think it's justifiable, but the allegory actually doesn't really work.
No, I think it's fair. That to me is more a matter of like how you told the story rather than the story you told type thing.
Right.
And yeah, like to me, like that kind of, even though like obviously just visually the image of the pigeons is nice, and I think it works well just given to allow like extra character development for Terry Malloy. It's like, oh, he tends to pigeons and everything, but you could have left that. You didn't necessarily have to say like, there are hawks looking around for the pigeons and like they'll swoop down and take them and everything. It's like, oh, I wonder what he's talking about.
Just like, this is the 1950s idea of subtle. But our of 1950s American Hollywood idea of subtle. I should be fair.
Yeah,
Italian cinema doesn't pull this stunt, but it's pretty amazing. I mean, like I actually like most of the pigeon scenes, with that exception, because it stands out. Actually, partly because it's in those scenes, and that scene makes Malloy seem like a person. His connection to what was his name, Joey?
Yeah, I think her brother's name is Joey. Yeah.
Yeah, his connection to Joey makes sense. I mean, that whole thing makes a lot more sense with the context of the opinions, but in the middle of that, it's like heavy-handed metaphor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like the film does engage in moments of sort of like underperformance and subtlety, so like it does just feel wrong. I mean, in one of the best ways, like you said, the whole like Brando's relationship to Joey. I mean, what did he do to get him on the roof? He said, "Oh, one of your pigeons, came over to my coop. I want to bring him over to you." And then basically, like you wonder, like how close was Brando to this guy at the beginning? But when you see how important the pigeons are to Terry Malloy's character and the way he cares about him, you get a sense that these guys, even though they wouldn't necessarily call themselves best friends, had this sort of strong bond, which was unspoken, but it does play into like the personal costs that Malloy has to go through, like at almost every point in this movie.
He seems, I mean, like Brando does a good job at conveying that when they push Joy off of the roof, he seems utterly shocked of what he was involved in.
Right. Exactly. I mean, he knew, he wasn't, doing clean cut work, as they say. No, but he probably thought, like you said, or maybe he allowed himself to be convinced that, they're just doing what they normally do. They'll just push him around a little bit just so he doesn't cause too many waves.
Yeah, they figured they'd hold him over and maybe beat him up. They didn't figure he'd kill him.
Yeah. And it's funny, it's like, again, it goes to the whole issue of like the rationalization we tell ourselves. Like, and Brando is, to me, you know, the story is about coming to the realization that his whole recent years have just been attempts to rationalize the status quo. So, I mean, like, for example, like after, you know, being forced to take a dive and literally, I mean, I'm going to oversell this a little bit to prove a point, ruining his life. And he says it even in his famous speech, I'm a bum, let's face it. I mean, basically that act to force him to take a dive so they can have short money ruined his life. And he's, even in the aftermath of that, he's still sort of justifying going along with it. Then they kill Joey and he's shocked and he's clearly dealing with it. But even that isn't enough to break him, as it were, and realize what he's doing. And it's only through really getting to know Eva Marie Saint, beginning to not actively hate or at least disregard Carl Malden's priest,
Right.
and then finally seeing his own brother, who, I mean, we didn't really talk about it. Rod Steiger, plays his brother and is more, I wouldn't necessarily say he's the number 2 guy, but he's definitely of the higher ups to Johnny Friendly's.
Yeah, he doesn't seem really stand out though until you get him in the car.
Right, exactly.
I remember watching the movie and like I felt like I couldn't even really remember his face until you get to the "I could have been a contender" speech.
Mm-hmm. And it's really like people know that could have been a contender, which is really the second half of that scene. The first half is really Steiger's half of that performance, and Steiger really, I think, does well. I mean, to the point where, so to provide context, like the suspicion that Malloy is going to talk is very high in Johnny Friendly, and he basically says to his loyal, second-hand guy, Rod Steiger, says, "Look, you're going to have to deal with your own brother, or like, is he, your own brother?" And basically threatens his life.
And also basically, says, it's a threat in his life, and deal with it. You can either kill him or you can fix it, but you got to do one or the other. Right,
and it's to the point where, Steiger, I mean, this is, where like Brando, even in that car, when he gets in that car, I think he's honest when he says, "I really don't know what I'm going to do." I think he's honest there. And I think once his brother pulls the gun on him, I think that's the full realization where he says, "No, this has all been rationalized bullshit." And, his brother, but his brother, to his credit, can't harm his own brother. Right. Steiger cannot harm Brando, and it costs him. And we find him hanging dead near the end of the film. And to me, that's the arc which is the most interesting arc, even more so than whether or not this is a parable for communism or anti-communism, what have you. Even more so than like how does a doc work in a sort of like, give me the details, and like basically what neo-realism almost always attempts to do, which is provide a realistic or quote unquote view of the subject they're depicting. To me, it's like, weirdly, I'm more interested in the artificiality of the story, the more traditional element of it, which maybe sets me apart from a lot of people who watch it. I don't know.
Yeah, but we're modernist. I mean, it's interesting, like when you think about the cycles of film, right? How like neo-realism, is kind of new to cinema, but it's basically just 18th century realism on film. I mean, 19th century realism on film, 19th century realism. So it's it's Upton Sinclair. It's also
Balzac too. I mean,
and Balzac, Steinbeck, and everybody who wrote for Harper's between 1870. And I mean, it's interesting because we don't think of that as innovative, and in a way, it's not, because it's a callback to from a narrative tradition to something earlier. But in film, it is interesting that came about so late, and I think maybe because film was still thought of itself as theater for so long.
Yeah, and I would say that tension in this film actually makes it very interesting, and in part because this film, acknowledged or not, has influenced two filmmakers I'll bring up in a way that sort of displays their neo-realist roots and also why they're not neo-realists. And it's Martin Scorsese and Spike Lee. So if you think about, like, one of the best comparisons I would say to this movie is like Goodfellas. And like, yeah, Goodfellas definitely has a lot of the elements that you would expect with On the Waterfront, sort of like rough and, you know, the rough underbelly of New York society. They're not upper class people, they're blue collar people, they're connected to the mob. You get a sense of the inner workings of things. But at the same time, there's an artificiality to the story as well. There's in Goodfellas, like, there's, you know, flash cuts, there's interesting uses of music which aren't just background music that has come to the foreground. You have reference even to, at the end of Goodfellas, to, you know, the great train robbery, you know, where, you know, Joe Pesci's shooting into the camera. To me, that it is, I mean, I think, you know, the fact that, you know, On the Waterfront has both the sort of neo-realist element plus the artificiality to it helps explain that. And I think it's even more extreme if you look at Do the Right Thing, which is, you know, again, has elements of a realistic view of like what's going on in Bed-Stuy, but at the same time very artificial, of people talking to the camera, or interesting, you know, cross-cutting features, or, you know, something which brings attention to the fact that this is a film. And I think, in a weird way, I don't think this was the intention of On the Waterfront, but I have a feeling that just by virtue of how On the Waterfront was, you know, basically is as an end product, helps sort of develop that sort of view of film, which to me, it's sort of like a modern, I think of it as parallels to modernism, but in a way that neo-realism made possible. And it made possible by not following the rules of neo-realism.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you see the tensions in this movie. You see it in the acting styles. You see it in the fact that it still uses fairly conventional dramatic monologues in a very staged sense. You know, both Malden and, but basically all the three really star actors have a major speech. Johnny Friendly, maybe not as much.
Yeah, I would say when his speech at the beginning, when he talks about coming up in the docks, and then I would say some of his exchanges are sort of mini speeches. But yeah, you're right.
Carl Malden has two big speeches, and that, like, it really, like, his purpose in the movie in a way is to, like, give the moral high ground speeches periodically. It is interesting, the tensions here, and you even see that tension in, like, we brought it up earlier because Rocky is obviously, you know, partly based on the Waterfront. I don't know if Stallone ever acknowledged this, but it's sort of, I mean, like, the I Could Have Been a Contender is almost pulled straight from it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like, whether he knew it or not, it's his attempt to say, like, what if, especially for America in 1976, we need something hopeful. What if Terry Malloy didn't take the short money, in a way?
Yeah.
What if Terry Malloy actually had, you know, the chance? I mean, the funny thing with Rocky is people forget, in the first Rocky, he doesn't win. You know, he just had the shot, but he gave a goddamn good show. That's
the first Rocky is actually interesting onto a film, which it's weird to say that about a Stallone movie, but I mean, it is. It's the only interesting onto a film by Stallone. But it is, and it's interesting because I think even popular cinema in the 70s was highly influenced by this.
Yeah.
Ebert, I believe, make sure I quote him right, but said that, you know, On the Waterfront completely changed the way people acted on camera.
Well, I would say yes, or even we can even make it a little bit more generic because I think it's important. Elia Kazan changed the way people acted on film, in part because think about the films that Elia Kazan made: On the Waterfront, A Streetcar Named Desire, East of Eden. You know, think all three of those films are doing the same thing in terms of that acting, and in part it's bringing Marlon Brando, in part it's bringing in James Dean, it's bringing in that sort of style from the 1950s theater, which was, let's be honest, very different, very radically new.
Yeah, I mean, you know, another filmmaker we haven't mentioned because he is so very different, but knew Kazan and worked with him, was Stanley Kubrick.
Yeah.
You know, Kubrick said that Kazan could get miracles out of actors and get people to do completely different things. And, I mean, it's also interesting because Kazan, you know, despite his his House of American Activities things seems to have stayed fairly lefty most of his life.
I mean, he always was a liberal and on the left side of things more so than other things. But I would also say he has an attitude which is probably anathema to a lot of leftists, which was he's a Greek immigrant, and in his mind, and in a lot of immigrants' mind, the United States is not just a cesspool of corruption and unpleasantness. And you even get a sense in the later movies, despite everything he can do in his films to criticize what's happening in the United States, it's still a symbolic area of hope or change. And he was always, in a way, very pro-American, which to this day feels more anathema. Like, it's harder and harder for some.
And it's not.
It absolutely isn't. I don't want to give the impression that, like, oh, he's just an apologist, because he's not.
And I mean, gosh, all the actors we wouldn't have known without him. I mean, he doesn't give us Brando, but arguably he gets the best performances out of Brando, at least until maybe the 70s.
Yeah, I would say, like, the best performances we got out of Brando up until the new wave, like, I would say Bertolucci and Coppola give us the second wave. It was Kazan, almost exclusively. Now, I wouldn't say perfectly exclusively, but, like, the first ones.
Julius Caesar's good, and that's not Kazan.
Yeah, exactly. I think an older English gentleman had something to do with that one.
But he gives us Warren Beatty. He gives us Andy Griffith. He gives us Rip Torn. Rip Torn. Rip Torn's still acting.
Yeah, he barely alive, but yes, he's still acting.
Is he? I think maybe he's dead now.
He's alive, but he is completely gone in terms of being a drunk. It's
but I mean, like, you can still see Rip Torn acting as late as what? I mean, like, 5 years ago. So
we also didn't mention Martin Balsam, who has a little mini role in this, but everybody remembers Martin Balsam from Psycho. You know, the guy who infects her, who falls down the staircase very ludicrously. Even him, he's in that group. And Martin Balsam is. I always tell people, he's like, if you see Martin Balsam in a film, it's not going to be completely bad.
He got really good acting out of Gregory Peck, although he didn't introduce us to him. But
yeah.
But I mean, like. And it's just weird because when you hear all these early directors listed, all your early American auteur directors, I don't feel like you'll hear Kazan listed except for people who are theater buffs.
Yeah, I mean, let's go into this because, like, we're tiptoeing around what happened to Kazan, and I think, to me, like, what sort of helps summarize Kazan's position is in the mid-90s, or actually maybe it was like around 97, so I guess that's still mid-90s. He won I forget if it was like the Lifetime Achievement Award or a Thalberg Award at the Academy Awards, and Scorsese and De Niro give it to him on stage. You look into the Hollywood audience, very famous actors and people did not stand up or applaud. They looked mean-faced at him. They wanted to punish Kazan in their ever so slight and insignificant ways. Very famous. Nick Nolte was very famous as not being a guy who stood up. Ed Harris didn't stand up or do anything. I think it's an embarrassing moment actually for Nick Nolte and Ed Harris to have done that, but needless to say, I think that is sort of getting to the point of why Kazan. Whether, I mean, it doesn't say why the audiences don't know him per se, but I think it helps because it's indirect. Like, it's the Hollywood system which is uneasy with him, and it's not uneasy with him as an artist. It's uneasy with him for his not even his politics, for that one act.
Yeah, because his politics isn't out of line with Hollywood. Actually, even after the fact, it's not like he becomes a raging conservative afterwards. He's not. St. Whitaker Chambers.
I think it was A Face in the Crowd, which comes a few films after On the Waterfront, which is actually, this is something that Spike Lee speaks very well of. He loves this movie. It's really against this sort of, if I remember correctly, it's really against this sort of like media culture, or, you know, the way that sort of like post-war American culture has sort of manifested itself. That ain't a righty movie.
No, it's not.
And so, like, but yeah, you're right. It's I would say, this may get us in trouble for saying this, like, Hollywood and the American left in general and more so American liberals than the American left, have a very schizophrenic attitude to what was going on in the 1950s. Not just with HUAC, and let's set HUAC aside, because I think you and I agree, like, that was a very strange and unpleasant and unsupportable exercise in power on the part of Joe McCarthy.
Yeah, like McCarthy. The problem with it is when you talk about HUAC, and I want to set it aside, but only after I make this caveat. HUAC is an insane exercise of power that was completely unethical. Sadly, it actually discredited some of the very things it set out to expose. And one of the things about the difference between American liberals and the American left, and you and I, like, you know, people who listen to this or read know that I would have considered myself part of the American left, not liberal left, until somewhat recently, is that I hear communists who are way more honest about what was going on in the 1940s and 1950s in regards to the Comintern and infiltration than liberals have been. And some of that has to do with not wanting to come down on FDR and World War II politics.
Yeah, there's a lot of convenient forgetfulness when it comes to this. One such convenient forgetfulness, not the biggest, I'm building up to the biggest one, is that our famous liberal heroes, you know, the Kennedys, were big on HUAC. They were pro-HUAC. Let's not pretend that they didn't have their role to play in that.
Oh, no. The Kennedys were diehard anti-communist. Actually, it's interesting because I like to point out how, you know, and I'm not a Nixon fan. He did some horrible, horrible things. Don't get me wrong. But how Nixon did not live up to our expectation of what a conservative is now, but also how the Kennedys in some ways would come off completely different if people were more honest about their politics, because they were very big tax cutters. They amped up the Cold War. Yeah,
we do have this like great myth that had Kennedy lived, the Vietnam War wouldn't have started, ignoring the fact that he was very active in building it up. And,
yes, Eisenhower did start it, but its acceleration into a war instead of just advisors was under Kennedy.
Right. Let's still be fair. The real break happens in Johnson, but Kennedy is not slowing it down. Kennedy is really not showing signs. I know that people have internal discussions from Kennedy, some actions to remove some advisors, but, you know, Kennedy vacillates on this topic. And
a big supporter of McCarthy. He was a big supporter of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And I don't think you would ever... Well, hell, Oliver Stone. That's all I should have to say. Yeah. Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone has done a lot more to help us forget a lot of things than he has elucidated things, unfortunately.
Right, and, I don't think Oliver Stone has ever made a historically honest film in his life.
Right, and the funny thing is, I'll still defend JFK because I think it's a well-constructed, artful movie, but I know it's full of shit.
Actually, I like it as a movie, but actually, I think his one good movie that I thought was really honest was Nixon, which is the one that's the odd man out.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well,
because he's actually really fair to Nixon, but
I would say the other important history that people tend to forget, and it's the nature of what was the goal of communism in the 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s. And the goal, the American liberals are acting like, it was just people who wanted to change things. They thought they were basically socialists. Socialists ain't communists, and communists know the difference, and they will tell you the difference. The goal was to create basically a new state, and the goal was to undermine the traditional liberal American United States. Don't pretend it was otherwise. You're not honest. That was the stated goal.
The American Socialist Party opposed the CPUSA.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny how, and I don't know if it's a matter of proactive forgetfulness or just ignorance in general. There is a difference between socialists and communists. A big difference.
Well, yeah, although that gets collapsed now. Basically, not only can they not tell the difference between socialists and communists, they can't tell the difference between Keynesians and socialists. So
Yeah.
And like really center right liberal presidents who happen to be black and socialists.
Mm-hmm. So in my mind, like, you know, yes, people like to collapse it. Like, it was a question of, should people have been punished for having a critical opinion or any opinion which wasn't part of the status quo? My response is, I agree with you. No one should have been punished for that. That was part of the basic framework of our society. Let's accept that HUAC was a disaster and should never have been built. But let us also be honest and say, do you really think the communists just wanted to make sure that they had like a representative in Congress? Give me a break. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, and maybe the people who, in Hollywood who were communists did believe that, but they were stupid.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I read Kazan is in his dealing with it. I think Kazan came to that realization, and Kazan got spooked by it. Understandably so. I mean, let's not pretend that like, it was just a rosy bunch of people who were all on the up and up. They just wanted to drastically change society. Even if that were all it was, I don't think he would have even said anything. I think he said something because in the way that sort of organizations manifest themselves like that, they basically act like that, like the dock workers would. They intimidate. They set standards of what is good and is not good. I mean, we all do that to a certain extent, but when you're doing it in a sort of clandestine manner, you're more willing to use physical force, and you're more willing to, pretend that, what things that are important to you don't matter. I mean, you'll rationalize it away. Again, this is why I say, to me, like, the biggest part of the film, the thing that resonates the most, is the whole question of how do you rationalize being in the condition that you're in. And I think those organizations are the best rationalizers you will ever encounter.
Having been a part of one, I would agree. But, it's again, when people talk about this now, even us, we are very disconnected from the context. There's an excellent book on this, and I think people, when watching on the Waterfront, should probably read it. It's called 4 Anti-Communist Manifestos. And it talks about not what just happened to the right-wing people. It basically makes the argument that the reason why Whittaker Chambers ends up writing for the National Review is because no one else would talk to him. I mean, it's literally, it says like he found God, but he was probably still a good liberal till everybody shunned him. But it also talks about Kosler and then 2 other people who are not as famous.
Yeah, so actually, one thing I will bring up with Kosler, and again, why the Hollywood blacklist I have mixed feelings about. Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon was something he actually wanted to have made as a Hollywood film. Very famously, Dalton Trumbo, who is one of the big guys who got blacklisted, took pride in the fact that he prevented Koestler's book from ever seeing the light of day as a film, in part because Dalton Trumbo was an unapologetic Stalinist. I think you can see it very obviously now.
No, he justifies things that the Comintern did later that we find out, like... what upset Kosler, and this again, like, people misread a lot of the quote anti-communist, is they, like, some New York intellectual communists who were a little bit more outspoken on things, I believe, about Spain. They were disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, they just got summoned to the Comintern, even though they were not under any Comintern's legal jurisdiction, and they were never seen again. It's one of those things like that happened. It's in fact, now that the Soviet archives are public, not all of it, but a good bit of it's public. Now, we know it happened. We have it from the Soviets on records, and they were doing that all over. I mean, the most dangerous, the most likely person to get hurt by a communist were socialist-leaning communists, period. And this is true not just in the United States. It was very true in Europe, and even in the CCP, like in the Chinese Communist Party. Most of the early leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, almost including Mao, even though Mao was a dedicated Stalinist, was killed by the Comintern. Most of Mao's comrades A bunch of them are summoned to a delegation in the Comintern in the 1930s. Like, one of them came back.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And it was happening in the U.S. And between that and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which no one could justify, I mean, that's what set everything off. That's what broke a lot of communists. It was not right-wing concerns. It was actually, even from a communist standpoint, left-wing ones a lot of the time. And what alienated a lot of the people was how liberals reacted to them. And it's interesting because, you know, the same liberals will talk about how awful and how much of a butcher Mao and Stalin was, sometimes to the point of lying and exaggerating about it. But they'll defend Stalinists. It absolutely baffles me. And you see it in Kazan, and it's something that I don't like to go into politics in the film podcast, but you can't not with this movie because you feel like it's not been shoved down the memory hole exactly. But it's never. I feel like it's literally it's a lingering of baby boomer misunderstanding of 1940s left-right politics.
I think that's part of the reason that On the Waterfront is sort of muted in cultural consciousness is because it's a manifestation of bad consciousness,
right,
of the time. You know, not just because the film is intentionally trying to do that, but I think it's just the way that a couple generations, not just the boomers, but the generation above them who were politically active at that time, approach that film. It brings up bad feelings or complicated feelings.
But I mean, like, the thing is, by the time you get to the 70s, most of the 50s communist filmmakers are no longer communist.
Right.
And I'm not just talking about the ones who couldn't work. I mean, most of them just have been. It's like most of the writers. Richard Wright starts off as a diehard communist. He doesn't die one. He's probably still but he doesn't die sympathetic to Stalin. God, when you name the 30s, you think who wasn't a communist, and you get to the 60s and you think who was.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's true.
I mean, you know, the Beats had socialistic sympathies except for Kerouac, who was a uber right-winger. But
I would say the three Beats that you'd think of, only one really was sympathetic to Trotskyism in some way, and that was Allen
Ginsberg.
Allen Ginsberg.
Burroughs' politics are harder to pin down. But
Burroughs is political, but apolitical. By that I mean, like, political concerns are in his work, but he is not a party member of anything.
No, he doesn't trust anybody.
Right.
He's paranoid for that.
Yeah.
And Kerouac ends up being like a kind of an obnoxious white-winger who drinks himself to death. But
well, yeah, Kerouac actually was very pro-HUAC, and there was the story of how every morning he would like have cereal and like cheer and applaud McCarthy whenever the HUAC hearings were going on.
It's really strange because I also think people misread them. I mean, we could just call it going like people not understanding the politics in movies and film just, 20 years after the fact. It's pretty amazing. I mean, and we're almost like that too, if we, like, to be fair to, the people we're talking about. There's a lot of people who really, really misread the politics of a lot of 80s movies, I think.
Oh, right. I mean, yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, we'll go off on a tangent if we go there, but I agree.
But I'll give it one example but as an example, I was reading someone called Terry Gilliam's Brazil, a Thatcherite allegory, which made me almost fall down laughing.
Yeah, that's funny. Of course, the information retrieval charges feature would complicate that, wouldn't it? Yeah,
right.
It's a critique of Thatcher as much as it's a critique of...
It's a critique of like corrupt lefty bureaucracies, but it's just as much a critique of Thatcher and all that. But people they read the dominant politics of the day back into the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's happening with Kazan too. People think since he testified at HUD, and maybe that was unwise, but why he did it is completely understandable. And a lot of Arthur Miller's like anger at him seems only justifiable actually after the fact about things which he could not have known, which was how far Huac was going to actually take all that.
Yeah, I think I forget at the end of Miller's life whether or not he sort of relented on his anger with Kazan. I want to say he did.
Well, they basically broke ways over it though for like 30 years.
Oh yeah, I mean, as far as their working relationship it was completely done at that point. But I the thing with Arthur Miller, I have to look into it, but I never really am sure whether or not he reconciled with himself what was going on in his politics. Not specifically his politics, but the politics of the world around him, and whether or not that resulted in him giving a reappraisal of Kazan or anything. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure he did either. I mean, there's other people who did. Henry Miller did, and it's interesting because American intellectuals are slightly better than maybe say French ones on that. And Kazan has a similar fate to Camus. Camus is like a theorist that like every liberal now loves, and an author. Mm-hmm. He's not the greatest theorist in the world, even I'll admit that.
Yeah, but I don't even think he would have conceived of himself as a theorist either.
No. The amount of crap he gets for some of his complicated stances on Algeria, for breaking with the Communist Party, for not being totally hostile to Christianity, or Islam, actually, either one of them, is pretty amazing, particularly in France.
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's a good book that Tony Judt wrote. I always forget about like French
responsibility.
It was specifically on the French left, but I think he wrote a number of books.
It was like on Aron Camus, and it's very interesting. You kind of get the feeling that even if this movie, even if this movie had been a blatantly anti-communist allegory, if he had never gotten involved with the McCarthy hearings, Kazan would have been okay.
Right. No, I think it's absolutely true, and that's the point. That, like, I think any of the sort of anger with Kazan cannot or does not manifest itself as a critique of his films, though it results in people ignoring the films a little bit. It's all about this one particular event.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, even when people talk about like A Streetcar Named Desire, they talk about it as if Kazan's not like I've listened to lectures on that class. People don't mention on that play. People don't really mention Kazan. They mention the playwright.
Oh yeah, and people ignore the fact that Kazan was people ignore the fact that Kazan was instrumental in working with Tennessee Williams to get the play to where it is. I mean, I wouldn't say it's to the point of he's the co-author, but his input cannot be forgotten.
Right, and all we have to do is look at later Tennessee Williams' plays to see the difference. No, yeah.
So I think we spoke for about an hour on the film. Concluding remarks. I'll let you go first on this one.
It's a very important film to watch, I think, and if you're in a place where you can spring for the Criterion edition, I would. You can find most of this film online, but I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean,
you can't download it though, legally or illegally, as far as I know. I mean, maybe you can from like Amazon Prime or something, but I don't have access to that. I'm in Mexico. There you go. And it's a very interesting movie because you will feel a tension between the styles of acting that you're watching and the realism that the movie is attempting versus the fact that it's still a 1950s movie.
Right. So to me, like, it's one of those perfect movies where you can get almost anything you want out of it. So if you read it straight, just like a movie to watch, you'll be entertained. If you use it as a means of seeing the transition from an old Hollywood to a newer Hollywood, you will see it clearly. The transition in acting styles, you will see it clearly. If you want the politics surrounding the movie and the social context of the movie, be it either Kazan's personal politics or the social and political background of trade unionism in New York, you will see it.
In the 50s in specific.
In the 50s in specific. I mean, it is one of the highest achievements of the Hollywood system. I mean, I'll go that far. And I think it will be that way regardless of whether or not people choose to watch it and remember it or not. And it's funny, and this is the film where even if you haven't seen it, you've experienced its influence. Again, so we're in this odd tension of directly people know it, but don't watch it that much. But the people who do watch it are people you've watched for years. So Scorsese, Sidney Lumet, Spike Lee. Think about anybody in the generations after this. You cannot escape the influence of this movie. You might as well go to the horse's mouth and see where it was all coming from in the first place.